A Small Town Christmas Reunion by Melinda Curtis. Chapter 1. Vince Patrizio got out of his favorite sports car, a new red Ferrari, looked around the railroad stop retreat in Harmony Valley, a rundown two-story motel on a pine-filled mountaintop, spotted a small group decorating the exterior grounds, including his wife, the woman who'd bolted after they sealed their wedding vows nearly 12 years ago, and told Jill, not without some frustration, "You served me with divorce papers." Predictably, Jill took one look at Vince and hot-tailed it into the retreat's office, a separate structure that looked like a small house. Her exit coincided with the opening verse from the Chipmunks' Christmas Don't Be Late. Vince drew a calming breath. I should have anticipated this. Jill was a runner, always had been. Of all the things Vince loved about Jill, avoiding conflict wasn't one of them. With a nod to the Christmas decorating crew, all of whom he was familiar with, Vince headed toward the office. There would be time to talk to them later. But the crew wasn't to be put off. "Dad!" Teddy ran toward Vince, putting a hold on his plans. Jill's son was all smiles and gangly legs, tinsel mingled with his walnut-brown hair. "Are you here for Christmas, my son?" "I'm here." Vince smiled warmly, not entirely sure how to respond in more detail than that. Teddy was the reason Jill had proposed to Vince at the end of their senior year. Her date had drugged her on prom night, and Vince's fingers curled into fists. Jill hadn't told him the details, and he hadn't asked, because while their teenage friendship had bloomed in the year they'd gone to school together in Las Vegas, he'd fallen in love with her. Marry Jill? Heck yeah. Be a father to her unborn child? Absolutely. He'd eagerly stood with Jill at the altar in Vegas, ready to create the safe, loving family unit he'd never been a part of. And when the wedding vows were finished, when he'd received the invitation to kiss his bride, Vince had taken Jill into his arms and kissed her the way a man kisses the woman he's lucky enough to spend the rest of his life with. And wonder of wonders, she'd kissed him back, as if she felt the same way. For a brief moment, everything in Vince's life was the way it was supposed to be. But after the kiss was over, when they'd stared into each other's eyes for a handful of heartbeats, after that, Jill ran, taking his ring, his name, and his heart with her. And although Vince had kept tabs on Jill from afar for over a decade, he hadn't seen or talked to her until a few weeks ago. She'd asked him to meet her at the funeral of Brian Salazar, the man who'd drugged her and gotten her pregnant. Grieving, Brian's family had wanted to meet his child. Scheming, they'd wanted to establish their rights to a relationship with Teddy, despite the crime that had created him. They'd had a lawyer present to press the point home at their son's funeral. It was then that Vince learned it wasn't the first time the Salazars had tried to lay claim to the boy. They'd offered Jill money to give up her son before she'd even given birth. Imagine that. The slimy Salazars were the reason Jill had proposed to Vince. Without a second thought, Vince had lived up to his wedding vows at that funeral and told those vipers that Teddy was his son. Lacking distinctive features, they looked enough alike to pull it off. Teddy's dark brown hair to Vince's black, Teddy's dark brown eyes to Vince's black. But the Salazars weren't easily scared off. Their lawyers were taking this to court. Jill still needed the protection and power of Vince's family. His grandfather owned a large, luxury casino on the Vegas Strip, the Bella Vista. They had a team of cutthroat lawyers. Jill still needs me, if only for legal reasons. Ignoring her situation wasn't an option. Running away wasn't an option. Divorce wasn't an option. Me. I'm her best option. "Dad?" Teddy stood before Vince, smile falling into a look of uncertainty since Vince hadn't greeted him with more than 2 words. Having only met at Brian's funeral, the boy had every right to feel insecure. They didn't know each other. But that's going to change. Vince shoved urgency and exhaustion to the back of his mind. In his desire to get to Harmony Valley, he hadn't slept in over 24 hours. But this boy, my son, he reminded himself, needed a proper father figure. And fast, in case the court requested Teddy appear in court. Vince laid a hand on the boy's shoulder, trying to put him at ease. "Teddy, I bet you're trying to decide if we should hug, shake hands, or acknowledge each other with a nod." Despite his best intentions, Vince's gaze strayed to the office and its big front window. A Christmas tree with white blinking lights obstructed his view of the interior. He didn't know if Jill was inside watching or not, but he did know that didn't matter. Teddy was his. It was far past time that Vince proved that to everyone, and made this marriage real. Vince returned his attention to Teddy. "What do you think we should do?" Teddy regarded Vince with a serious expression, Vince normally associated with a much older soul. This boy has been through something that chipped away at his innocence. Vince could relate. His childhood hadn't been idyllic either. Teddy needs me too. Vince picked the tinsel from Teddy's hair as he waited for the boy's answer. He tucked the glittery strands in the pocket of his dress slacks. Teddy wore a black hoodie imprinted with the words, "Railroad Stop Retreat." It was too big for his slight frame. His blue jeans were too short for his long legs. His feet were too large for his body. Here was a boy in the midst of a growth spurt. Soon, he'd be a tall teenager in need of a father figure, an ever-present father figure. "When we first met, we shook hands," Teddy said slowly, referring to Brian's funeral. "But I still don't know why you haven't been around and—" "A fist bump, then." Vince extended his knuckles. "It's not as formal as a handshake and not as familiar as a hug." Teddy looked relieved as he tapped his knuckles to Vince's. "Nice. You'll get your answers," Vince promised him, "as soon as I get mine." Vince took another step forward, only to be waylaid by a small family unit, all of whom wore blue jeans and the same black hoodie with the retreat's name on it. "Your car is red like Christmas?" Little blonde Maddie spoke first, her hands full of the tinsel she'd been layering on an outdoor fir tree when Vince drove up. She was 6, a numbers whiz, and possibly the reason for the tinsel Vince had removed from Teddy's hair. "There are 9 letters in Christmas." Maddie proceeded to spell the word while counting the letters on her fingers. "Smart girl." Vince hadn't been around many kids. He patted her on top of her golden head and tried to ease past. Sam thwarted his progress next, enveloping Vince in a bear hug. Vince wasn't a hugger by nature, but he and Sam were best friends. They'd served in the Marines together, taken enemy bullets on the same day from kids barely older than Teddy, and spent the past few years leaning on each other, confiding in each other, prodding each other to get well. Vince with his bullet-riddled limp. Sam with his kid-triggered PTSD. Lately, they'd both been doing better. Case in point, Sam was interacting with both Teddy and Maddie, and he didn't look pale, stumble, or pass out. As for Vince, his limp was never going away, but with exercise and a weight regimen, it was practically impossible to notice. I hope anyway. When Sam was done pounding Vince's back, the taller man released Vince, dark eyes taking inventory. "This is a surprise. I was just on the phone with your grandfather. Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" "I didn't realize it myself until last night." Vince had been served divorce papers late, got in his car, and driven straight from Las Vegas to Harmony Valley, California, a place he'd never been but checked on regularly because this little place was where Jill had run to after their wedding ceremony. She had family here, including her cousin Annie, Sam's fiancée. Annie moved into Vince's way next, her short, wispy blonde hair fluttering in the chill, late-afternoon breeze. Her hug was brief, awkward even. Then Annie fixed Vince with a searching stare. "Are you going to need a place to stay?" "I hope not." But there'd been those divorce papers. Vince glanced toward the small house containing the retreat office in what looked like a former single-car garage. Why? Divorce after 11 years, 7 months, and 3 days of marriage? Yep, he'd counted. He'd driven 15 hours over some of the most boring highways Nevada and California had to offer. What else was he going to do but look back on the mess he and Jill had created of their lives? Of our chance at true love. "My dad is staying with us," Teddy said to Annie with a mixture of pride and possessiveness. "Because we're family." Vince nodded. "That's right, we're family." He broke free of his welcome party and went off to find his wife, and somehow proved just that. Jill stood behind the check-in counter, trying to compose herself for the confrontation with Vince, reminding herself to be firm. I can't let this marriage go on. She'd used Vince long enough. She had to cut him loose, the way she had her parents when she bought this place from them. Jill stared about the office, at beige walls with framed photographs of family and the retreat when it was new in the 1960s. At the scuffed wooden floors and the pink Formica counters, At the 5-foot-tall Christmas tree decorated with lights and trains, and the wreath decorated with gold ribbon that hung from the inside of the front door. And she tried to think about her plans for renovation and upgrades. If only memories weren't slinging themselves to the forefront of her mind like chunks of ice in a hailstorm. Those memories chipped away at her resolve. Those memories, there were just 2 vivid ones, and both of them were when Vince had kissed her. Movement outside the office drew her gaze. Vince approached, strides nearly disguising his limp. He wore black slacks, a white dress shirt, and shiny leather loafers. No jacket or sweatshirt warded off the December mountain chill. His black eyes were a little too discerning to fit small-town Harmony Valley. His black hair was a little too long to fit the corporate mold. He always looked out of place standing next to me. Too sophisticated, too controlled, too smart. That's how she'd thought of him all these years. A man who was too much, a man who was out of her league. Because if Jill dwelled on their wedding kiss, I will not think about kisses, or emotional crutches of which Vince had been hers. But if she'd learned anything these past few weeks, it was that she couldn't just pretend to be strong, hiding behind a wedding ring and the Patrizio name. It wasn't fair to Vince. It was time to reclaim her strength and stand on her own. That's my Christmas present to me. There were only 16 days until Christmas. But with Vince here, Christmas was coming early this year. Jill went over her rehearsed lines, the ones she'd been planning to recite when anticipating Vince's call after receiving the divorce papers. She hadn't imagined he'd show up here. But here he is, literally. Vince opened the office door, entered, and then closed the door behind him, holding ground on the welcome mat, his finely chiseled features almost softened by the gold beribboned wreath behind him. He merely stood there, tall, stylish, and silent. His expression, proud, regal, and controlled. His lips were pressed in a flat line. His lips, unbidden, Jill thought about kisses. His kisses. The first time Vince had kissed Jill had been on their wedding day. The heartfelt feelings Vince's kiss had created inside Jill had terrified her. A recent victim of assault, she hadn't counted on wanting Vince that way. Theirs was supposed to be a marriage of convenience, a sham between friends to protect her baby from her attacker's parents. She'd left Las Vegas and her maternal grandparents and returned to Harmony Valley in this place. At first, she'd expected Vince to show up. For Christmas, for New Year's Eve, for Teddy's birth, she'd prepared a speech in her head. Something like, "I can't be your real wife, not after what happened to me, but I need to be your pretend wife, if only for a little while longer." But he'd never come charging in, never demanded his marital rights, and never asked for a divorce. Why had he never asked for a divorce? She'd been afraid to contact him and ask. Vince must have moved at the doorway, made some sound, because Jill's focus returned to him and those strong arms that had swept her close a few weeks ago after Brian's funeral. It was then that Vince had told Jill he wanted to reconcile. Then that he'd kissed her a second time, again creating a conflicted response. Again she'd panicked and left Las Vegas. But this time she'd done the adult thing, drawn up divorce papers, and finally he'd come after her. Because he wanted to stay in an unconsummated marriage? That made no sense. Neither did the way Vince stared at Jill, facial features having eased into mixture of longing and regret, as if our marriage had been real. How could that be? "I let this pretend marriage go on for too long," Jill began, resorting to the openings she'd rehearsed ever since she'd called a divorce lawyer a few weeks back. I'm sorry, too." Tone conciliatory, Vince strode forward with that hitch to his step, a quirk that made him seem less perfect to strangers but not to her. "I gave you space that I thought you needed. And then, life got in the way." Vince rested his elbows on the check-in counter, clasped his hands, and stared into Jill's eyes, as if he wants to kiss me again. Jill's mouth went dry, and then went drier when she noticed that Vince still wore a plain gold band on his left hand. Had he worn that wedding ring the day of Brian's funeral? She couldn't remember. I should have removed my wedding ring. It sent the wrong signal. But something had kept Jill from doing so, even after she'd signed the divorce papers and sent them off to him. She regretted that now, if only because Vince didn't seem amenable to divorce. "I told myself I'd divorce you when I turned 20, Jill returned to her script. "And then 25, but 30. It's time, don't you think? Vince shook his head slowly. I married you because you wanted to protect me, Jill finished for him. You never asked questions, and I appreciated that because our marriage held the Salazars off until Brian's death. But now? I learned this week that his grieving parents are demanding a DNA test, Vince said in an emotionless voice that nonetheless inspired emotion in Jill, fear. This isn't the time to get a divorce, Jill. Outside the office window, Teddy was being chased by Maddie around the 6-foot-tall live fir tree in the yard. Her son's expression was innocently gleeful. Jill wanted to protect that innocence. She planned to take the truth of his conception to her grave. Vince shifted and sighed as if standing bothered his injured leg. The Salazars had 2 boys, both dead now. They're desperate for a connection to Brian. And because you didn't report what Brian did years ago, Jill, his parents have an avenue to pursue in terms of visitation. Jill felt chilled, trapped, victimized once more. My lawyers feel we need to present a united front and live together. Vince reached across the counter and took Jill's hand, her left hand. His thumb brushed over the small diamond ring he'd given her all those years ago. We need to stand behind the argument that it isn't in Teddy's best interest to reveal how he was conceived, or to subject him to visits with the parents of a criminal who— This isn't a rash decision, Jill gasped out. She'd spent too many hours staring at the ceiling after talking to a lawyer, considering strategies and weighing it against what was right. Jill gently withdrew her hand from his. A divorce adds to the legitimacy of my defense that it isn't in Teddy's best interest to introduce something new during this time of upheaval. I consulted with my own attorney. Granted, her lawyer wasn't as high profile as Vince's, but the laws they were using for her defense were the same. Vince looked disapproving. Oh, he didn't frown. His mouth remained in a straight line, but his brows lowered, ever so slightly. We're not getting divorced, Vince said in that steadfast, even tone of command he'd used with her a few weeks ago when he talked of Reckon's hand over hers. Don't you want to be free of me? Jill's words sounded meek and indecisive. She pushed on anyway. Don't you want to pursue other women? No. Vince's black gaze bore into hers, so determined, so passionate. Because I love you. The earth shook. You love me? Jill stared at their hands, those wedding rings, trying to process his proclamation of love to see if it changed anything when it came to her decision to end their marriage. It didn't. If anything, it made her that much more resolute to see this through. You're doubting my feelings, Vince said, an edge sharpening his tone. No. Jill tried to appear as committed to her decision as he was to challenging it. If only he wasn't saying things she'd only dared dream of. I'm trying to be honest with myself and with you. I can't be your wife, Vince, not in the truest sense of the word.